This is Michael Matheson Miller, and you are listening to the Moral Imagination Podcast. Welcome to the Moral Imagination Podcast. Thank you for listening. This is episode 1 of the podcast, and I'm delighted to have as my guest Professor James Audison. Our topic today, and I think a good place to start, is Aristotle and the good life. What kind of life makes a good life? Aristotle asked, is it honor? Is it pleasure? Is it money? Or is it a life of virtue? Now, my guest today to help us walk through these questions is Professor James Audison. Jim is the Thomas W. Smith Presidential Chair in Business Ethics, Professor of Economics, and Executive Director of the BB&T Center for the Study of Capitalism, and the Executive Director of the Eudaimonia Institute, all at Wake Forest University. Jim has an undergraduate degree from the University of Notre Dame in the Program of Liberal Studies, which is a great books program. He has an MA in philosophy from the University of Wisconsin and a PhD from the University of Chicago. Jim's been a professor at the University of Alabama, at Yeshiva University in New York, and now at Wake Forest. So he's the author of several books, including Adam Smith's Marketplace of Life, Actual Ethics, and a new book called Honorable Business. Today, Jim and I are going to discuss Aristotle's concept of eudaimonia, that is human flourishing or excellence, happiness, and then what it means to lead a good life. Now, you'll notice that about halfway in or so, the conversation starts to have an echo. Unfortunately, I didn't hear it at the time, or I would have stopped and started over again. So I apologize for the echo. Now, some of you may be able to make it through to the end, but if you're like me and you're sensitive to echoes, you may not be able to handle it. So let me give you a couple of takeaways from the end. One, Jim is a prolific reader, and so I asked him, how does he go about getting so much reading done? And he explains that he sets a time to read without distraction, which of course is important, and he reads several books at a time at about 15-minute increments. And this way he gets through a good number of books each year. I also asked him about some of his favorite books, and he talks about his love for Homer's Iliad and how it made a very deep impression upon him as a young man, and now how he's reading it with his own children. So if you can handle the echo, you'll hear more about it, but if you can't, I wanted to at least give you those takeaways. And finally, regarding the Iliad and the Odyssey, if you're having some trouble getting through the text, I really like the audible version of the Fitzgerald translation that's read by Dan Stevens. So for those of you who watched Downton Abbey, Dan Stevens, it was the Matthew Crawley character from the early seasons. So I think this is an excellent reading. I like it a lot. So if you're having trouble getting through the book, get the audible recording with Dan Stevens. So now to the podcast with Dr. James Audison and Aristotle and the good life. So Jim, you and I met several years ago at a conference. I think we met at a conference on Burke and Payne. And Brad Berzer was there. Yeah. And we discovered all three of us, you, Brad, and I, were at Notre Dame at the same time. And you and Brad, of course, are great friends and knew each other. And I regretted not knowing you then, but I'm glad I know you now. So,
likewise, Michael.
Well, thanks for joining me on this podcast.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So I'm happy to have you today. I could, as you know, I could ask you probably 100 questions on everything from Adam Smith and Karl Marx to business, Aristotle, martial arts, and Notre Dame football. But I'm going to try to stay focused. All right. And we'll talk about your work at the Eudaimonia Institute and a bit about your new book, Honorable Business. All right. So let's why don't we begin? Why don't we talk about your work at the Eudaimonia Institute and some of the things that you're working on there? What makes a good life? Are there things worth dying for? How do we think about and strive after genuine human flourishing for individuals, for families, and for societies? So I want to hear a little bit about how you got to where you are. I mean, I've given your basic bio, but maybe before that, why don't we at least talk about what is eudaimonia?
So start with the hard questions.
Right.
Well, eudaimonia is the word that Aristotle uses that's usually translated as happiness or flourishing. But it's really a deeper concept than the English word happiness would suggest. So in English, when we say happiness, that can mean pleasure, it can mean contentment. But for Aristotle, what it meant was something deeper than that. It was something like cognizance of a life that is well and fully lived. So using all of the capacities and abilities you have, given the circumstances and opportunities that you face, in the service of ends that you think are worthwhile. So it's really a deep sense of fulfillment and a knowledge that you're doing the best you can with what you have in making a life that was worth living. And so that's a deep concept. And of course, a lot of those terms have to be defined. What actually constitutes, what are ends that are worth serving? Which of our abilities should we use, and how do we know that we're using them well? So there's a lot that goes into that. But the Eudaimonia Institute at Wake Forest, that came out of so a lot of work that a lot of my colleagues and I are doing in different disciplines, where we're trying to figure out what are the institutions, the political institutions, economic, moral, cultural institutions, if culture is an institution. What are the institutions that seem to conduce to lives like that, eudaimonic lives? What are the institutions that encourage people to lead those kinds of lives? And then what are the institutions that get in the way of it or that prevent it? And what we wanted to do with the Institute is to encourage some cross-disciplinary thinking about that. So you have people in psychology departments who talk about elements of that, and philosophy departments, economics departments, political science departments, and other places. But we wanted to see if there was some headway we could make in really understanding what does it mean to lead a life that is well and fully lived, and what are the institutions that would seem to, anyway, encourage such a life. And so the Institute is an interdisciplinary institute that's meant to bring together experts from different disciplines to see if we can make some headway on those questions.
Great. So a couple of questions then from that. So in one sense, I mean, like eudaimonia, this idea, in Aristotle says that in your happiness is the one thing we choose for its own sake, right? We don't choose it for something else. So everything we do, right? I think somebody gave the example once. If you button your coat so it's cold outside, and you don't want to get cold because you want to go on a date, because you're in love with this girl and you want to marry this girl, because you want to have family, right? So everything has an end. But what do you do happiness for? I just want happiness. I just want a full life. But then you also extend it here to this kind of a life well and fully lived.
Yeah.
So what would you say, for example, is there one way or a certain way to live a life well, or what makes a life well lived?
Well, that's another hard question. You're 2 for 2, Michael. So you're right. So Aristotle thinks that the way he understands human beings is that they may be alone among all creatures on earth. Human beings have a hierarchy of ends or hierarchy of goals. So we have these proximate ends that you were talking about, the things we do on a day-to-day basis. Those are serving intermediate or midterm ends. And then those are in the service of longer-term ends, which finally Aristotle thought had to be in the service of some final or ultimate end, which is what he called eudaimonia, or happiness or flourishing. So he has this idea that there is a kind of hierarchy. And one of the things that human beings can do, again, maybe uniquely among creatures on earth, is that we can think about those ends and maybe change them. So we can take different plans of life. We can construct different paths of lives to take in the service of ends as we think about and deliberate, well, what are the ends that I should be serving? What would constitute that ultimate end? And then we could sort of reverse engineer all the way back to the things we're doing today. Are we doing things today that will actually conduce to or lead us to the final ends that we want? So we have this deliberative capacity where we can think about these things and then try to organize our lives and our behavior in terms of it. But the second part of your question about, well, what really is a eudaimonic life? Is there just one? The answer is, well, sort of yes and no. So for any one person, there probably is one ultimately eudaimonic life, meaning since each of us is unique, each of us has a unique set of abilities and skills, a unique set of opportunities that we face, a unique set of constraints that we face. And given all of those opportunities, and of course, even things like luck and chance might figure into it, the people we happen to meet, the opportunities we happen to get, given that unique signature of opportunities and skills, et cetera, for any one person, there's probably going to be a best life that one person could lead. But since we're unique, each of us will have a different kind of life that will be unique to us. So, yes, there is one kind of life for each of us, but it's not the same life for all of us.
So maybe it's unique in the sense that each of us is a unique, unrepeatable individual. But there's also some type of general framework. Like, so, for me, jumping off buildings is my eudaimonia, without a parachute. Or, for me, unemployment and drug addiction, right? It's not, this sense is not simply some kind of like radical autonomy of the will, whatever you choose, right? But it's somehow it's a unique individual fit in with a general plan of what it means to be a human being.
Right. So it's not anything goes. And since human beings are unique, but they also share a common nature. So there are some things that will be true for all human beings because we're human beings. So to give you one example, loving relationships with others is something that seems to be necessary for a truly happy human life. Right. So we have to have relationships with other people that are loving in a deep and important kind of way. And they can't just be any loving relationship because we're human beings and not other kinds of creatures. So given the kinds of creatures that we are, with the psychological and biological toolkit, makeup, the kind of soul, if you allow me to use a word like a soul, the kind of soul that we have.
You can use the word soul.
Okay, thank you. Aristotle used it too. So given the kind of soul that we have, which makes us human beings as opposed to other kinds of beings, certain kinds of lives will be appropriate for us. Other kinds of lives won't. So that can be for mundane things and deeply important things. So a mundane thing is, you're not going to be happy if you drink mercury. So why is that? Well, if you drink mercury, you're going to get sick and die. Given the kinds of creatures we are, drinking mercury is going to be incompatible with happiness for us. On the other hand, having a loving relationship with, say, a spouse or a child or a friend, that's the kind of thing that will be necessary for us, again, given the kinds of creatures that we are.
Right. Okay. So, and to simply make so that there are certain things that each of us is going to need in a maybe a unique way, but they're all the same because we're human beings. And there are some ways to do this well and other ways that will make us unhappy. And so we need to learn, for example, how to have loving relationships, right?
Exactly.
Right. So it's not just anything goes, but not even within the context of loving relationship, not anything goes, right? There are certain ways to do this and other ways that will fail, that won't produce loving relationships, right?
Absolutely. And the high rates of divorce are an example, are a testament to that, because we get this wrong a lot. And when people are in the wrong lines of work, and there is such a thing as being in the wrong line of work, it doesn't necessarily mean there's something morally wrong with what you're doing, but if it's not a fit for the kind of person you are, then that's going to have a significant impact on whether you're ultimately happy or not. And the same thing with loving relationships. Lots of times we make mistakes about that. We are fallen creatures. So we make lots of mistakes about what kinds of relationships to have with others, with whom to have relationships. We make mistakes about that. But another part of the Aristotelian picture is that human beings also have what he called phronesis, or judgment, practical judgment. Mm-hmm. And that's something that develops over time. So you try something, you get some feedback, you act in a certain way or behave in a certain way or make a certain kind of decision, and we get feedback, usually from other people, positive feedback or negative feedback. And when we get that feedback, that allows us to modify and develop our judgment. So over time, the more decisions we make, the more experiences we have, the hope anyway is that we get better at making good decisions for us given the circumstances that we face, and that comes along with the development of good judgment.
Right. So okay. So this phronesis is this practical wisdom is this almost like a trial and error, and this trial and error of experience, but within a general map of life, like a plan of life. So that there's the small map. So if you used maybe like I don't know if this is a good analogy or not, but you have the map of the nation or the map of the world, and then within that you have maps of cities, and each person is maybe their own city, but there is a map of the world in which they fit. And if you're off the reservation, off the map, then you end up actually unhappy, right? So there's this double finding yourself within the context of what it means to be a human. Is that a good summary? Yeah,
absolutely. And earlier we talked about the capacity for deliberation. One of the things that Aristotle says is that if we just do whatever comes our way, and we just sort of let the society or the environment push us in various directions, we just make choices without thinking ahead. So without thinking about our ultimate end, our intermediate ends, our proximate ends, and how they link up. If we're just making these sorts of random choices on a minute-to-minute or day-by-day basis, that's a recipe for unhappiness, because it's not appreciating and recognizing the kinds of creatures we are, which includes all of these aspects of what it is to be a human being, what it is to lead a happy life as a human being. If we're not thinking about those things, then the kinds of decisions we're making on a day-to-day basis stand a good chance of being incompatible with that. So that's really a recipe for unhappiness.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So let me follow up. I do want to actually go in my notes. I want to hear a little bit about how you got to where you are, but let's keep going on this question of eudaimonia, and then we'll come back to that. All right.
Okay.
So in one sense, despite the fact of incredible economic and technological achievement, there's still a lot of unhappiness, right? You mentioned divorce rates. There's a lot of struggling. A lot of people, young and old, don't have like a good map or a good plan of life or an idea of how to be happy. So they're kind of struggling and they're not happy. They can't find their way. So there's two things I want to say. Number one, Joseph Ratzinger said after the fall of the Soviet Union that relativism didn't die. This kind of sense like anything goes didn't die. He said, but it actually combined with a desire for gratification to form a really potent mix, right? So it's just kind of like relativism, anything goes, and I want desire of gratification. These two, a potent mix. And if you live your life this way, you may have, a couple of years of pleasure and a big party, but it's going to blow up in the end. You're going to be unhappy, right? So if you're thinking seriously about eudaimonia, well, I mean, maybe react to that, but you're thinking seriously about eudaimonia, human flourishing, where do people begin, right? What do you tell your students? There's a clinical psychologist in Canada named Jordan Peterson. Have you heard of Jordan Peterson?
I have, yes.
Okay, yeah. Anyway, so he said, when people ask him what to do, where do I start? He says, okay, you got to tell the truth. You got to be honest with yourself and honest with others. Because if you tell lies, then you start messing up your maps of the world. And you got to clean your room. Those are the two pieces of advice he gives people. So what about like when you're with your students and maybe they come either in classroom or after, like, okay, you're talking about, we've just talked a little bit abstractly about eudaimonia, about human flourishing and making right decisions, and phronesis, this idea of, practical wisdom. But what do you tell people in a world, if Ratzinger's correct, and I think he is, what do you tell people in a world that's mixed with this kind of that is relativistic and values mere gratification, but ultimately makes you happy? How do you resist that? What do you do in that situation?
Yeah, that's a tough and good question. I think the first thing you have to do is you start with the end. So one of the things that Aristotle says is that thinking about the kind of life I want to lead in a deep way, that's probably not productive when you're a kid, because you just don't have enough experience. You haven't developed any practical wisdom. So you're not going to have any basis, no foundation yet on which to even begin to start thinking about, well, what kind of life do I want to have led by the end of my life? And so that means there's a very important role for parents, because when one of the main jobs of parents is to set some parameters so that children begin to guide their lives in the right direction by developing some good habits. But once you grow to the point of young adulthood, so college students, that's the time when you actually do need to start thinking about this on your own. And so what I would say there is you need to think about start with the end. If you imagine yourself at 80 years old, what kind of life would you at that point want to look back on and say that was a life worth having been led? Now that's a hard question to answer, but that immediately sobers you to the idea that, I only have one go at this. This is my only life in the entire history of the universe. I am only going to lead one life. And the scarcest resource I have is my time. There was a time when I came into existence, and there is a time, unfortunately, when my existence will end. And so that is an absolutely precious resource, that life that I have. So I need to think about what's the best I can do. And you can leave it, I think, you can leave it to an individual's good judgment. In your terms, what do you think is the kind of life that you would be proud to have led, that at the end of it, you would look back and say, yes, that was a life worth having been led? Now, that might not tell you one thing, it might not map out the whole plan for you. And of course, there are lots of contingencies you can't plan for. There are unexpected things and chance and even things like you were mentioning a minute ago about technology changes. So different kinds of opportunities will come into existence. So there's still a lot of uncertainty there. But thinking about it from the end and then trying to reverse engineer back to today, that can be the start. That's where you start. So that can begin to give you an answer to, well, why am I going to college? Or why am I majoring in what I'm majoring in? Or why am I trying to go into this field? Or why do I want to work for this company? That can give you an answer. And even later in life, as a middle-aged person, you can say, well, I've spent the last X number of years in this field or with this company or doing this. Now this gives me some guidance to think about, is this the best use of the precious resource of life that I have? So the way to begin, I would say, is, I like the clean your room, start by cleaning your room. I might say something like, the first thing to do every day is make your bed. When you make your bed, that gives you a small sense of accomplishment and you're getting some order in your life.
I think there's some data, there's some people have done some studies on that, right? That it actually does help you make your bed, right? I know the days when I make my bed that are better than the ones that I don't, for sure.
Yeah, I think it seems intuitively like there might be something to that. And also what you said, that Peterson said about honesty, I would say one of the things you need that's connected with honesty is self-awareness. And that's much harder than I think we might think, and much more important than we often give it credit for. Right. We have to have some sense of who we are. What are we capable of? What are we good at? What do we know and what do we not know? And I think we're often not very clear about that. So part of the deliberation about what kind of life I should lead really ought to include a pretty clear-eyed view of who I am as a person, what I can do, what I can't do, what I'm good at, what I'm not good at. And it's not just about, sometimes we tell people, oh, you got to find your passion and follow your passion. Being passionate about things is only part of the picture. That's important. But the other part of it, and this is, I think, something that we often don't talk enough about, is that we have to figure out a way to create value for other people, too. When we talk about our passion, following our passion, that sounds an awful lot like it's all about me. I should do whatever I want. But that, again, is part of the recipe, ultimately, of unhappiness, because if it's necessary for me to be happy, that I have loving relationships with other people, that means that I have to reach out to and stretch myself out to others. I have to connect with them in a way that they find valuable and that they will then respond in a positive way to me. So it can't just be what I'm passionate about. It has to be, ideally, it would be at the intersection of A, what I'm passionate about, but B, what value what kinds of things can I do that would create value for other people that they would appreciate and they would value?
And doesn't Aristotle have some quote about that, like some intersection of value and?
Yes, that those have to be connected. So we are not islands. And although I value autonomy, I think autonomy is a very important part of human nature. In fact, it's a crucial aspect of human moral agency. God gave us the ability not only to choose the right, but also to choose the wrong. And I think so free will and autonomy are crucial aspects of our nature. But that doesn't mean that we're islands. It means that we need to make choices that connect us in deep and meaningful, and I would also say virtuous ways to other people. And then that becomes a recipe ultimately for happiness. So, and by the way, if I could say one other thing about that, connected with a part of what you were saying a second ago about technology. Social media is a tremendous boon in many ways. So the digital age, it lowers transaction costs in all sorts of ways, increases productivity in all sorts of ways enormously. But one of the dangers it runs is that it can incline us to think that having 1,000 friends on Facebook means I have 1,000 friends. And that's not what that means. The care and concern and love we have for other people, or that we can have for other people, is itself a scarce and limited resource. And so it needs to be guarded. It can easily be dissipated. And if you dissipate that, especially if you're dissipating it among 1,000 people, most of whom don't return it in any meaningful way to you, that care or concern, they don't return it to you in a meaningful way, that too can be a recipe ultimately for being unsatisfied with your life and wondering what the purpose of what you're doing is. Right, so to avoid falling into that trap, that's why we need to think very carefully about starting with the end. What kind of life will I want to have led, given the kind of person I am, and given as a human being, and then also given the human condition, the kinds of constraints and opportunities I face.
Right. So with the end, before we move on here, and we could spend the whole time on this, but it's Aristotle, right? It's Aquinas, Augustine, the Stoics, right? This is thinking seriously about what it means to lead a good human life. Aristotle, this is a statement and with a question, I guess, too. So that for Aristotle, like getting the end wrong is a big problem, right? I mean, you have to get the end right. And so Aristotle says what? That the end is not pleasure, is not honor, is not wealth, but the end is virtue, right?
Yeah.
So what does he mean by a virtuous end? Because that doesn't sound very fun to a college student. You can either be you can either have pleasure, money, or virtue. Like I'll take virtue, right? I mean that's not a good. That's not like. So what does he mean by virtue, and why would someone want to choose virtue over pleasure, honor, fame, and money?
Well, so there are really two questions there. One is what's better about virtue than those other things, and a second question is, well, given the kinds of fallen creatures that we are, how likely is it that we're actually to choose that? Because the virtuous life is often a difficult life. So one of the problems with using the word happiness as a translation of eudaimonia is that happiness can mean pleasure, it can mean contentment, and it's very easy to and by easy I mean literally easy to seek a life of pleasure or pleasurable contentment that won't actually create the deeper eudaimonic state that Aristotle was talking about. And I think one way to think about this, Michael, is that a second ago I was talking about being self-aware and taking sort of a clear-eyed inventory of the kinds of creatures we are. We are capable of receiving pleasure and feeling pain, but that's not all we are. And I think a lot of times people make the mistake of feeling like or acting as if they think all we really are pleasure centers, and that's not true.
Right, that's a problem. I mean, so that's like the of many problems with utilitarianism. One is this kind of leftover, like all we are is pleasure and pain. I think it's one of the problems of materialism too. I mean, this kind of scourge of materialism. We're stuck in this hall of mirrors. Like all there is is this material me with pain and pleasure, and I better maximize my pleasure. But maximizing my pleasure doesn't necessarily lead me, or almost certainly will not lead me to a eudaimonic state, right?
No, it won't. And that's not to say that eudaimonia doesn't include pleasure,
right?
But oftentimes virtue. So you asked about virtue. If we're thinking about what exactly is virtue, virtue is going to include sacrifice in the service of an important or valuable end. So depending on people's circumstances, I mean, think about being a parent or raising children. Is every moment when you're raising children a pleasurable moment? No. Do parents often have to do things that involve indeed pain, and sometimes a lot of pain? Yes, they do. Why would they do that? So that goes back to this question about virtue. The virtue of being a parent is raising children well, and that will mean oftentimes doing difficult things like saying no to them or letting them make their own mistakes and learn from their own mistakes. Those are some of the hardest things for parents to do. But if you're going to be a good parent, that's what you have to do. And so by analogy, you can think about, at the highest level, what does it mean to be a good human being? It means to have an understanding of what's the right kind of life to lead as a human being, the best kind of life to lead as a human being. And that will often require sacrifice, including sacrifice of pleasure. So sometimes what that'll mean is that I have to put away or say no to the moment-to-moment pleasures. Sometimes I have to sacrifice my contentment now so that I can achieve a higher goal later on. So being a virtuous human being will mean once you understand or have some sense of this hierarchy of moral value all the way up to the eudaimonic life, that you develop some principles, and those principles guide your behavior, even when in the moment or on a day-to-day basis, they might be very difficult and sometimes even painful to follow.
Right. There's a philosopher named Dietrich von Hildebrand, and he talked about joy. And I just thought it was very interesting. It's like we all want joy, which is, I think, maybe connected somehow to this eudaimonic state. I mean, maybe there's some differences for sure, but there's a sense of joy, and you can't grasp joy. He said, Joy is the super abundant fruit of a love relationship. Joy comes from these deep, meaningful love relationships, from sacrificing, as you said, from sacrificing in service of some valuable end. And so I think this is like going to that Ratzinger point of this combination between relativism and desire for gratification that leads to so much unhappiness, is that it misses the fundamental question, I think, that you see in ancient wisdom, that joy can't be grasped. It's really a gift when you're sacrificing of some valuable end.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and I think it's connected with, joy is a closer word, I think, to eudaimonia than happiness is, or than certainly than pleasure is, and it's connected to this idea. There's this concept in psychology called flow, and when you're deeply immersed in some activity that you're good at, that you're enjoying, what can happen is you get into the state of what psychologists call flow, where you sort of lose track of what's going on around you. You lose track of time. You just get completely swept up in what you're doing. And the joy of that kind of experience of flow is something that comes as almost as a byproduct.
Right.
If you aim directly at it, you won't get it.
Right.
But it can be the result of engaging in activity that you're good at, that you enjoy, that creates value for others. And then afterwards, or as a byproduct, you get this joy, this deep sense of, I was doing something important, and something that I deeply enjoyed there.
Right. I used to give, when I taught undergraduates, I used to give like some simple examples. And one of them was, when you go out with your friends and you have a really, really great time, right? Not the time that afterwards you're like, I shouldn't have been there. But the time when you're like, man, that was just so fun. And so like the next day, you're like, let's get together and do the same thing again. And it doesn't work. Because one of them was, in a sense, this friendship where a professor I had gave the example. He'd listened to it. I think it was Beethoven's Missa Solemnis, and he was deeply moved by it. And so when he went back to listen to it again, he was trying to grasp to be moved, and he wasn't moved. And so it was this and so it's an interesting kind of tension between, as you say, self-awareness and then the state of flow, where joy or eudaimonia becomes a byproduct of being immersed in something that the valuable end, as you described it.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right.
So before I move on, I remember when I saw you last, you were talking about one of the questions you asked the group that we were with, we were working at conference, and then with your students, is you say, what would you die for?
Yeah.
And this, I think, I want you to do most of the work on this, but you say, this, in the past, people would have an answer, right? But now, people are a bit confused. Maybe could you talk about that a little bit and how that relates to also thinking through this question of eudaimonia and your work at the Institute there? Yeah,
well, one of the way I came about this was, one of the first things that made me think about this several years ago was I was reading and thinking and doing a little teaching about the American founding. And a lot of the people who fought in our Revolutionary War were young people. And it's an interesting question to ask. These were people who, they were going up. You have to remember, they were going up against the greatest military in the world at the time. And for many of them, they must have known, or at least suspected, that they weren't going to make it through this. And they didn't know whether the revolution would succeed or fail. And yet they were willing to lay their lives down for it. And this led me to ask students, increasingly students, A, don't really know much about the founding. But B, don't really have an appreciation for the enormous risk that people were taking to try to create the world, the country that we enjoy, and the freedoms that we enjoy today. And so it led me to ask students, well, would you have done that? Would you have died for this idea of a free society? And a lot of students, sort of distressingly, weren't sure about it. And I think so. This has led me now to ask many in different audiences, well, what is it you would die for? And I think especially for a lot of younger people today, the answer is they don't really know. They don't really have a sense of what would be something that they themselves think is worth risking their own lives for. And that's a bit worrisome for a number of reasons. But asking that question, I think, puts a pretty strong and fine point on this idea that you only have one life, and you should lead it in the service of something you think is really important. So you need to think about, well, what really is important? What really are the eternal or the fundamental values that I want to serve with my life? If I could only accomplish one or a small number of things in my life that really are meaningful, what are they? And asking this question, what would you die for, is a way of getting at that, a way of provoking people to think about, oh yeah, that's true. I do only have this one life. And it's valuable. I shouldn't just waste it. I shouldn't just let it just while away the time and occupy biomass here on Earth until I'm gone. if this is my only shot at it, I better take this pretty seriously. And asking that question, I think, is a way to get people to see the importance of that and actually begin to think about it.
Right. You know, I think the monks would have this line, like, remember your death. And when you first hear it, you think it's morbid. But really, it's not a morbid question. It's a question about how do you get this state of joy of a complete, what Aristotle calls a complete life. Yeah. Let's move on a bit. I mean, I could ask you 10 more questions, but let's move on a bit. So part of course, you said earlier with your work at the Eudaimonia Institute is looking at the institutions that help bring about human flourishing. So the family, different social institutions, what Tocqueville would call intermediary institutions or civil society. And then, of course, economic order. And I know you do a lot of work with economics and Adam Smith. So let's first talk, what do you think are some of the key social institutions, economic institutions that are also important for genuine human flourishing?
Well, if people are going to lead a eudaimonic life, so just drawing a couple of the threads from what we've talked about already, what they're going to need to do is to develop. So they're going to have some conception of what their ultimate end is or what the best life for them individually is. But in order to know that, they're going to have to also develop judgment. We talked about what good judgment is and practical wisdom are. And so working back a little bit, what do we need in order for people to develop that kind of practical wisdom and practical judgment that could enable them to construct lives of meaning and purpose for themselves? That begins to get at the question of, well, what are the social institutions we need? What social institutions, what political or economic institutions are necessary to enable people to develop this kind of wisdom? And I think in general, it's really two specific things. One, people need the freedom to be able to make decisions for themselves. If someone else is dictating your behavior, then you get no moral credit or blame for it because your behavior is dictated or if it's coerced. So you need to be able to make decisions for yourself that you can get that respect your moral agency, that for which you get either credit or blame. So you need to have liberty on the one hand. But on the other hand, it's really just the other side of that same coin. You also need to be held accountable for your decisions. The choices you make, you should be held accountable for. So we respect you as a moral agent by giving you the liberty to make decisions about your own life. But on the other hand, when you make good decisions and you get have good consequences and good results, you get the positive feedback that's appropriate to that. If you make bad decisions, you need to feel that too. If you don't feel the negative consequences of bad decisions that you make, then you'll never be in a position to develop good judgment. I mean, it'd be like somebody, if you wanted to learn how to play the piano, and your piano teacher said, well, I'm going to outfit you with headphones so you can't actually hear what you play, and I'll never correct you when you make mistakes. Well, that might be a well-intentioned piano player, but you're going to frustrate your own end. You're never going to learn to play the piano if you don't get the feedback, positive and negative, as the case may be, of the things you actually do. So people need to have the liberty to make decisions for themselves, and then they also need to be held accountable for those decisions. So that begins to give us an idea of what kinds of institutions we need. We need institutions that protect individual liberty, so that respect people's decisions that they make about their own persons, about their own property, also the kinds of voluntary relationships they enter into with people, or if they enter into, whether that's formal contracts or informal or promises people make, we need to be held to those promises. And that's really the beginning. And I think in some ways is at the core of what the United States did at its founding. The United States government at its founding was the construction of a set of mechanisms, governmental mechanisms, that would enable people the freedom to make decisions about their own life, lead their lives as they saw fit, worship the God as they saw fit, do with their property as they saw fit. But on the other hand, respected them also as moral agents to say, if we're going to give you that freedom, we're going to hold you responsible. So if you succeed, hats off to you. If you don't succeed, then you need to make the change, make a different decision, change your behavior in the future. So now we're getting to the idea of what we need is we need a government that's going to protect property rights, which include the individual person's property, starting with one's own person, but also one's own private property. And this also then very naturally leads into the idea that what we need is economic freedom. We need to be able to partner, exchange, trade, associate with other people in a mutually voluntary way that can be mutually beneficial. So that begins to get us, that's not very far down the road, but that begins to give us a framework of what are the kinds of governmental institutions that we need. Now, and then the other part about it is you mentioned Tocqueville and intermediary institutions. We've talked about how people need loving relationships with others if they're going to be have the joy of eudaimonia. That also means that there has to be a protection, an allowance of, and even a protection of people forming themselves into groups that are mutually voluntary and mutual association groups around particular interests. So religious groups or charitable groups or music groups or chess groups or sports groups, things that matter to people. People need to have the opportunity to associate themselves with one another so that they can help one another achieve all of the steps that are required ultimately to lead to eudaimonia. So it needs to be a wide range of a wide scope of human freedom and a protection against other people invading or inserting themselves into the relationships that other people will generate.
Okay. So, one thing, this is maybe, we have to talk about this another time, but one of the things also that when you talk about intermediary institutions, I think of the sociologist Robert Nisbet, who would talk about the need for these multiple, not only associations that are like where you're joined together to do things, but also that have some claim of authority upon you. And this is a challenge, I think, for kind of what you call modern liberalism. And I don't mean liberalism, I don't mean right and left. I just mean generally like the sense of liberalism, the freedom and the individual. Like we want to be free and emancipated, but these voluntary associations that have some type of authority over us, then we can tend to become radical individuals with the state as our main authority, which actually, as Tocqueville points out, this type of individualism leads to centralization. Could you just talk briefly about how these institutions may play a role beyond than just kind of like, let's get together and have fun, but actually be a place both for human flourishing, but also a place that help limit, say, an intrusive state that would affect human happiness?
Yeah, I think those intermediary institutions are absolutely crucial. I mean, what they do, among other things, but one of the things they do is that they acculturate us to what it means to be a human being, what it means to be, and if you'll allow me to say, what it means to be a virtuous human being. How do we know what that's going to be? Well, we have to learn that from others and from longstanding institutions and becoming members. And by members, I don't mean something just superficial. I mean, creating as part of our identity as a human being, the membership in a group that has as part of what it is or part of what it does, some conception of a life well lived. That's absolutely crucial to our ability to have an understanding of what we should be doing as individuals and how we should relate to others. So think of a church, for example. The voluntary joining of a church, I don't mean just driving by and waving at the altar, but if you enter into a congregation and become part of a congregation and begin to take part of the culture of that church as your own identity, what that does then is it begins to help an individual construct a conception of what it means to lead a life that's well lived, because now we have a sense of what really is high and noble and what is not high and noble, what's acceptable and what is unacceptable. And that's what enables us, and I think this is why it's so crucial, that's what enables us to join into the kind of community that can generate the loving relationships that lead to ultimate human happiness. Now, you asked about how does that create a fence between individuals or groups on the one hand and the state on the other. I think one of the important things is to realize is that the governmental institutions in a liberal state, they are by design not meant to give you a sense of purpose and identity as a human being. What they're supposed to do is only create and protect an arena in which you, in conjunction with others, can create a meaningful life on your own. So they just create the arena. That means that the discovering of what a meaningful life is, and then the execution of a meaningful life, has to be left to these to individuals within these intermediary states.
Okay, good. Thanks. So yeah, that's a big, there's a lot of things I could follow up with on especially as you see a number of, what you would generally call, I guess, conservatives who like a limited state. Some have a problem with the fact that it's just an arena. And so that'd be interesting to talk about, but maybe I'm not going to go down that rabbit trail. Okay. I'm going to stay focused. So I just maybe, and again, just quickly on this, you talked about economic order. This connects to your book, The End of Socialism, where you look at what type of political economy is best for human flourishing on both a practical level, but also on a moral level. Now, a lot of young people today would say, look, this free economy stuff that you're talking about is quite harmful, and we need to have a socialistic type of market or a socialistic type of government that takes care of people better. And you argue, and I'm not giving you a lot of time to do this unnuanced answer, but you argue that it's not just practically that socialism doesn't help, but that morally it really doesn't lead to a flourishing life. Could you sum that argument up really quick? Because I do want to move on to a couple of other things, but I think you brought it up, and I think it's really important that we don't neglect the importance of economic institutions when we think about a flourishing life.
Yeah. So I'll just pick one little piece of it. Think about inequality. So in a market-based economy, will there be inequality? Yes, there will be. Will some people have more than others? Yes, there will. So for that reason alone, many people are suspicious on moral grounds of a market-based economy. And if a socialist economy or a description of a socialist society does away with or purports to do away with inequality or great inequality, that can sound morally attractive. One of the things I argue in that book is that, there are at least two different kinds of inequality that we might think about. One is just inequality in resources. Do some people have more resources? Are some people wealthier than others? But there's another kind of inequality that I think is actually more important, and that is regarding moral agency. Do people have authority over their own lives? And if you have a society in which people are making decisions for in their own lives and taking responsibility for those decisions, then what you have is a kind of moral equality that I think is actually much more attractive. So if it's the case that any offer I make to you, I'm going to offer to buy something from you or make you a job offer, if you have the right to say no, thank you, and go elsewhere, then that immediately establishes a moral equality between us. You can't make me do something I don't want to do. You can't make me buy a product or work in a job or accept a contract or anything else if I don't want to. And that means that immediately we have a moral equality. So even if our resources are different or even vastly different, we are now meeting each other as moral peers. And I think that's a much more important and morally significant conception of equality than mere inequality of resources.
Right, because you kind of miss, it's the corollary that we miss, like, okay, if this is the case, that too is also, if X is the case, well, Y is also the case, right? And so that if they're going to have economic equality that's forced, you're going to also force moral inequality. So exactly. I think that's an important point. Okay, so on your own personal website, and I'll put the links in the show notes. On your personal website, you write about the importance of academic inquiry and the pursuit of truth as part of something that leads to flourishing. Yeah. You've also spoken a lot about the importance of free speech and academic inquiry. Do you see coming threats to this academic inquiry, and what should be the response? I guess let's keep doing it in the context of human flourishing. What role does it play, and what should be the response to these threats be? And again, we just mentioned Jordan Peterson. I mean, he's going through this in Canada right now, where people are trying to shut him down, and he's forced to say certain things. What are you experiencing?
I think there is a growing amount of division on college campuses, and a growing sympathy for the idea that maybe certain kinds of speech or certain kinds of questions. So certain kinds of speech shouldn't be allowed. Certain kinds of questions shouldn't be asked. And I guess what I would respond to that is that, well, we have to remember what kind of institution we are. We're a university. At a university, a university is not a seminary, and it's not a political party. So if it were a seminary, then maybe you would say, well, look, there is a roster of things you need to confess or profess that you have to believe if you want to be part of this seminary. Similarly with a political party, if you're part of a political party, well, there's a roster of things you're going to have to agree to or profess to believe. But universities are different. At a university, our primary allegiance is to the process of inquiry itself. It's to this idea that we don't already know everything we need to know or ever will need to know. That we need to continue searching. That's the unique essence, I think, of what a university is. It is a community of people who continue to search, who continue to use this strange and peculiar aspect of human nature called reason, where they're trying to see, however through a glass darkly, what we can know about human nature and about the world and about the human condition. And part of what it means, of what that process of inquiry is, what it entails, is that there will never be an end to it. This is an endless. So even as we learn more and more, there's always yet more that we don't know. So on a college campus or a university campus, I think the primary allegiance should be to this open process of inquiry. And oftentimes, I think history would demonstrate this. Oftentimes, the greatest discoveries come from unexpected places. So we shouldn't fear challenges from minority viewpoints. We shouldn't fear diversity of ideas. In fact, on the contrary, we should celebrate them. We should encourage it. We should protect it. We should celebrate it. That's how we remain true to what I think is the long-standing, millennia-long tradition of essence of what a college campus is and what we do, which is to this process of unending inquiry.
Well, this goes back to Aristotle and Plato and this idea of philosophy beginning with wonder, right? And that philosophy, philosophos, the love of wisdom.
Love of wisdom, right?
And, it seems to me in that one of the problems we have is as the university, I think this goes back to this kind of this relativism, this rejection of truth, and also a limitation of reason to the empirical, where the only thing that's reasonable are those things which can be demonstrated empirically. Of course, you can't demonstrate that empirically, but that's another talk. But that what happens is it undermines the purpose of the university. And so instead of seeking after truth, a love of wisdom, then it has to become and can only become what Ratzinger called a dictatorship of relativism, but also that it just becomes a place for indoctrination. And a university is not supposed to be a place for indoctrination. And so it's kind of interesting. Like it seems that, and so somebody was commenting like, we may be longing for the days of relativism where you could say what you want, because right now it's almost as if you have to say certain things, and I think it undermines the university. But let me go. That's related to my next question. And so we're almost out of time, but I have a couple of questions. I think what we'll do is we're going to take your book on honorable business, and we'll talk about that another time if you'd be willing to come back.
That would be great. I'd be happy to.
Great. As that gets closer to the release, let's talk about that. That'd be fantastic.
Excellent.
So the thing I wanted to ask is, you talked about this idea, like we don't know everything. And in your book, The End of Socialism, you have a chapter on the knowledge problem, and you've also written what you call the great mind, and this problem that we don't know as much as we think. In fact, we know a lot less than we know. And this, of course, Adam Smith writes about, Friedrich Hayek, C.S. Lewis talked about the problem of scientism. More recently, Nassim Taleb talks about this kind of what he calls Harvard Soviet idea that you can just figure everything out and then socially engineer people. So here's a question for you. Like, we've just talked about the good life and leading the good life. How is the Eudaimonia Institute different, or is it different from, say, a social engineering problem, like nudging, like like this kind of libertarian nudge, right, of the behavioral economists, or the classic social engineering that we've seen throughout the 19th and 20th century? What makes what you do different? Or is it just kind of another variant form of, well, here's my view of the good life, and I'm going to try to get you to do it?
Well, so I certainly have a view of the good life, but I think what sort of institutionally, the Eudaimonia Institute, one of its premises, at least as far as I'm concerned, in my connection with the Institute, is that a central part of what will be required to lead a eudaimonic life is ownership of one's own life and this deliberative process of developing practical wisdom. So that by itself means it can't be a social engineering project. So I can't just channel you into the proper life as far as it appears to me. What I have to do instead is have really an enormous amount of faith in you that you can do that on your own if given the proper A, space to do it, and B, are held accountable as a moral agent when you try to do it. So I think one of the parts of human nature that a lot of the neo-behaviorists, the nudging behavioral economists miss is that we can't only pay attention to the outcome of an action. We also have to pay attention to the process that went into the action. And the process requires for human beings to actually make the deliberative choice. So if whatever else is the case, if your set of social institutions don't allow wide scope for individual human beings to engage in a deliberative process and to make choices as a result of that deliberative process, they will not be happy, even if maybe GDP goes up. That might be nice, but that's not going to be sufficient for capturing all of the essence of what it means to be a human being, which requires this process of making choices and being held accountable for them.
Right. So it's more of a broader sense. And also, just come by what you were saying too, is that it's when you think about it in the context of Aristotle, this is an ancient wisdom, right? This is reflecting, I think it was, who called it? Maybe Chesterton called it the democracy of the dead.
That's a nice term.
Right. I think Burke has something like this too, right? Where you're actually listening to trial and error of the past to pay attention to things. But I think the other point is right, that it has to, that's I think a good explanation, because if you're looking at the human being broadly and you're thinking about questions of joy, happiness, forgiveness, deep loving relationships, this directs you away from social engineering, which is usually a reductionist view of the person.
Yeah, no, I would agree.
Okay, so we're coming to the end here. So I have a couple. Well, let me say this: what do you think is the greatest, maybe one or two obstacles right now to human flourishing that we have, say, maybe globally or here in the United States? What do you think? You're worried about?
Well, I'll tell you one that I think you might not expect. So I'm not going to talk about terrorism or the debt, although those things are certainly worth a lot of careful thought and worrying about. But there's another thing that might be a bit more surprising, and that is the growing idea, I think, that human beings basically are nothing other than fairly complex machines. That they can be, and I think this idea is gaining ground in places not just in medicine and health, but also in things like psychology. That with the right signature of chemicals or the right signature of inputs and stimuli, we're going to get you running and humming like a complicated automobile or something. And I think there's a lot of that view. So everything from nutrition, as I said, and health and psychology, and even to things like school policy and educational policy, a lot of it is, well, we just need to create the environment properly so that the machine of human beings runs well and smoothly. That misses, I think, an enormous amount of what it means to be a human being. It leaves altogether out of the picture all of these intangible things that I think end up really making us what we are. Things like love and longing and sacrifice. And many of these things that seem, and also a bit of experimentation, trying something, and even when it seems from some external perspective not to be perfectly rational or won't lead to increased GDP, allowing people to work through problems on their own, even if we think we know that what they should do or how we could treat them. Human beings have a soul, and if we don't pay any attention to that internal life of the mind and of the soul and of what it means to be a human being, then we're not going to be fully appreciating what kind of a life human beings could actually lead. So I think that's a false. It's an attractive and seductive, but false path for a lot of what's going on in, as it were, the science of humanity.
Right. Well, I don't want this to be a mutual admiration society, or at least me only admiring, but I could not agree with you more. I mean, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I think it's a disaster. And, this kind of technocratic view of everything. And I think there's a couple other things that maybe I'll just add. I mean, I mentioned Ratzinger before. When Pope Benedict XVI gave this address called the Regensburg Address, which caused a lot of stir. But underlying that people missed was this idea that I mentioned before, that we've limited reason to the empirical. And so this has lots of negative consequences for politics and for everything. But what it does is it takes these fundamental human experiences in our life, love, joy, forgiveness, mercy, compassion, and it relegates them outside the realm of reason. And then we do this, and we combine this with the materialism, where if we think we can just kind of manipulate everything will fall into place. And it seems to me that this is really one of the driving flaws, and a fatal flaw, of much modern thinking. And I don't mean in the last 20 years. I mean over the last several hundred years, that the problem of evil, the problem of suffering, doesn't come from the human heart, but comes outside. And I think Solzhenitsyn has that line that, like, evil runs through the human heart. Yeah. And I mentioned Chesterton before. They said, what's wrong with the world? He said, I'm the problem with the world. And I think this idea that you get from Rousseau and others of this human perfectibility, that if we can just find out the problem, we can solve the human question. But the human question is much deeper than that. And this is where this Aristotelian idea of eudaimonia, right? This is where classic ancient wisdom, Christian wisdom, Jewish wisdom of like what it means to lead a good life, in conforming your mind to reality, I think is very important.
Yeah, there's no formula. We're never going to come up with the exact recipe where you follow these 27 steps and everything will be fine. That just will not happen. And I mean, just in this idea, Aristotle talked about deliberation on the good. That's not an empirical question. I mean, that doesn't mean that empirical matters aren't part of that question.
Right.
But you ask yourself, what is the good? And you're going to deliberate about the good or the good life. That's going to go well beyond just what you're able to observe with your senses.
Yeah, and love and mercy and all these fundamental human things, right? Okay, so before we end, I want to ask you a couple quick, shorter questions.
Okay.
We didn't get to how you got where you are. So do you want to at least give a summary? I did your bio, but what made you interested in these things? Did like something growing up, or did like something hit you? What made you decide to do great books and philosophy and all the things that you do, that you have kind of a consistent pattern? What was it?
Well, I mean, I suppose the short answer is it was a series of accidents. I just happened to I happened to end up in a class as a freshman, as an undergraduate, in which we read Homer's Iliad. And that book completely changed my world. It remains one of my favorite books. But it captured in a way so much of the human condition in just one book. I had gone into college thinking I was going to become a medical doctor, but that book just changed. That book and that class just changed my life. But in graduate school, I read this book by Adam Smith called The Theory of Moral Sentiments, which I hadn't even known existed. I read this book, and what this conveyed to me was, Adam Smith, of course, is much better known for his second book, The Wealth of Nations. But in the first book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, what that said to me was, there is such a thing as human nature. And if we're going to try to understand what human virtue is and what a virtuous life is, we're going to have to understand human nature. And that suggested to me that there was a kind of marriage between not just sort of empirical and factual and descriptive study of the world, but also we had to think about, well, what are the ultimate moral values that we want to champion in our lives? What are the kinds of strivings and longings that are appropriate and ultimately fulfilling and generative of deep human happiness that we should be thinking about? If you put those two together, then what that suggested to me in graduate school, and has really driven a lot of the work that I've done throughout my entire career, is that what we should be thinking about is what are these institutions that enable human beings to lead the kinds of lives that we think they should lead, that they think they should lead, that are worth living? And then what are the kinds of moral groundings that we can give so that at the end of our lives, we look back on it and we say, yeah, that was a life that was worth living. Putting those two things together, so sort of the descriptive aspect of in the empirical world and the institutions, alongside the normative aspect of recognizing that we are moral beings too, not just empirical beings. And looking for a union of those two things has been what's driven almost all of my work throughout my career.
That's great. Tell what specifically about the Iliad that moved you? Anything specific or just?
You have to keep in mind I read it when I was 18, but when I first read it, what that book brought home to me was the idea of that we talked about a little bit earlier, which is death. As macabre as that sounds, we are going to die, and if you're going to die, that means that you better think pretty hard about what kind of a life you're going to lead. And one of the main lessons I took out of the Iliad was this idea that here are these huge groups of these strong forces, groups of men who are fighting over really an idea, and the idea, ironically, was love. They're fighting really over love and being willing to die for love. This made me think, holy cow, what really are the things? Was it just foolish, or were they doing something noble? Should we admire what they did, or should we lament what they did? That, I think, is the beginning of the kind of wonder that philosophy can give you, and it can begin you on that path to start thinking about, well, what really does matter in life, and how can I internalize that into my own actual daily life so that I orient myself towards the things that do matter.
Yeah, that's great. I remember, too, I read Plato in freshman philosophy, and it took me a little longer to get serious, but I thought, wow, this is amazing. All these questions, like what is piety and what does it mean? All these things. So, yeah. Okay, I'm going to move to something a little bit more serious, and I need a 2-word answer.
Okay.
And that is football game, Notre Dame or Wake Forest. Who do you cheer for?
Oh, Notre Dame. I cheer for Wake Forest no matter who they play, unless it's Notre Dame.
Okay, you passed. All right. And so, all right. Here's a question. Just a couple of. You are incredibly productive. You're prolific. You get a lot of work done. You're running all these institutes. You're doing things. And we talked about this before, and I think our listeners would like to hear it a little bit. You have a kind of a plan of your day. Like you read a certain amount of time, you write a certain amount of time. How do you get it all done? And because you also have 4 children and you do all you have a rich life, right? You're seeking after eudaimonia, and you're not just simply a scholar. How do you do it? What are your work habits, or any advice you have for people?
Well, I appreciate the compliment. One thing is, I suppose we could just give up on sleep, but we do need sleep. One of the things that I do when I first wake up, and I get up early. So one general lesson is, I think you have to be disciplined about your day, and not just do whatever comes up, but have a kind of plan going into a day. First thing I do when I wake up in the morning is I have a series of books that I'm slowly working my way through. And so I'll spend an hour. The first thing I do when I get up is I spend an hour reading with no distractions, no phone, no devices, nothing at all. And I read about 10 or 15 minutes in each book. And then I put that book down and I move to the next book and I read 10 or 15 minutes, and I do this every day. And so what this enables me to do is that over a period of a week, a month, a year, I get an enormous amount of reading done, just because I'm slowly making my way through all of those books. So I'll give that as advice. I don't know if that would work for others, but that certainly works for me. And then the rest of my day, what I do is I carve out times of it when I know that, so during these 2 hours, what I'm doing is writing. I'm working on a book project or an article, and I'm going to work on that, and I don't allow myself to be distracted from it. So then I'll schedule in other time when this is when I respond to emails, and I won't respond to emails except during this time, et cetera. And I try to plan out my entire day like that. It doesn't always work out that way because, life throws contingencies up. And as I'm sure you have heard people say before, a man proposes and God disposes. So, if you want to make God laugh, tell him your plan. So think, things get in the way of that. But I think having that kind of plan and being disciplined to stick to it, making yourself stick to it, I think that enables me anyway, to accomplish a lot more than I would have thought otherwise that I could have accomplished.
Very good. That's great. Okay, a couple other ones. What's the best advice you ever got?
Don't be afraid to fail. I think too often we think that failure is something to be avoided, and if we're leading our lives in a way where we're risk averse and trying to avoid failure, what results from that often is that we don't try enough things. And so don't be afraid to fail. And if you fail, recognize your failure and move on. Learn from it and move on. Don't let it debilitate you, and don't wallow in it. Move on to the next thing. So don't be afraid to fail.
Absolutely. What view do you have, or idea? I mean, you probably have a lot of them, but you can just share one or two that most people hold that you think that's just completely wrong. You're skeptical about, or it's maybe an unfashionable opinion that you have.
An unfashionable opinion that I have?
I've got lots of those, but then again, I don't have friends to lose, so it's easy.
One of them is you can learn a lot from your enemies. So I think too often these days we think that if there are people who disagree with us, especially about things that really matter to us, that it's better to avoid those people, avoid talking to them, avoid listening to them, only talk to people who we think we have a kind of simpatico relationship with. I think that's a mistake. I feel like I learn at least as much, if not more, from people who deeply disagree with me or have a completely different worldview of mine. So I spend a lot of time, I'm a Christian, I spend a lot of time reading the work of secularists and atheists. Yep. Because I feel like I learn a lot from it. And so people who have differing views about politics or economics or morality from me, I think you can learn a lot from your enemies. So enemies, I use that in a metaphorical sense. I don't mean any kind of physical, but intellectual adversaries. I think that's something that should not be avoided. In fact, should be sought out and welcome.
Right. If you only stay in your comfort zone, then you end up quickly becoming an ideologue instead of actually wrestling with what. And I think it goes back to this point. That part of a good life is that you are a philosopher, right? All men desire knowledge, and all men wonder. And I think part of it is you have to engage complex things. So, all right. Very quickly, what top books do you recommend? What do you think? Okay. What should people read? I mean, you can do something you're reading now, but also just like, these are the top 3 or 4 books that I think everybody should read. They're just great books.
Well, in the great books category, I would recommend 2 that I've already mentioned. One is the Iliad. If you have not read the Iliad or have not read it recently, read it again. I think you'll be shocked and amazed, astonished at how deep and how beautiful in a deep way that book is. And another one I would recommend for people who are a little more serious and looking for a little bit more of a serious treatment, read Adam Smith's Theory of Moral Sentiments. It's that's 250 years old nearly, but boy, has that book stood the test of time. It's just loaded with deep insights about humanity. So those are 2 sort of in the great books category. One book that I just finished reading that I'll recommend to you and your audience is a book that just came out. It's a biography that's written by someone named Neil Monnery. It's a biography. The title of it is Architect of Prosperity. It's a biography of someone who people don't know enough about, named Sir John Cowperthwaite. That's a mouthful. Sir John Cowperthwaite was one of the chief architects of the amazing run that Hong Kong has had. So he was when Hong Kong was part of a British protectorate, a Commonwealth of Britain. He was a chief finance administrator in Hong Kong, and at the conclusion of World War II, for the next couple of decades, and he was one of the people that led to its amazing turnaround from one of the poorest places on earth to one of the most wealthy and prosperous places on earth. It's a fascinating story, and Cowperthwaite himself was a Scotsman who saw himself as being in the Adam Smith camp. So it's a really fascinating story. I'd recommend it.
Great, thank you. All right, well, first, thank you so much, Jim, for joining. There's more I could ask you, but you've been very generous with your time. Can you tell us real quickly, where can we find you? Where can, like, any links? I'll put these links up in the notes, but
sure.
Your books or the
sure. So all of my books are available on Amazon.com or any other bookseller's site. I do have a personal website. It's my name, jamesaudison.com. And then if you go to Wake Forest University's website, look for the Eudaimonia Institute, you'll find more information about me and about a lot of the activities that we're engaged in and the projects we're working on now.
Jim, thanks. Always a pleasure to talk to you and to learn from you. Thanks for your time today, and best wishes with all your work.
Thank you very much, Michael. My pleasure.
My guest today was Professor James Audison of Wake Forest University and the Eudaimonia Institute. Thanks for listening.